It was only after John the Baptist's arrest that Jesus began his own ministry. He started wandering the villages and towns of Galilee, gathering around him a group of followers, his disciples. He also began performing a series of miraculous acts that form one of the most contentious aspects of his life, and preaching a dangerous message that would soon bring him into direct conflict with the ruling powers. In the next part, we will see how the gospel story of Jesus took him from the hills of Galilee to the Jewish capital Jerusalem, where his life would reach its climax.
What we really have with the stories of Jesus is that in his own time and place, he did have a reputation as a miracle worker.
I'd call Jesus a revolutionary. He did what revolutionaries do. He challenged the structures of power.
There's nothing that's happening by accident. He does seem to have a plan. He is what Dorothy Sayers calls the man born to die.
According to the 4 gospel accounts of his life, it was only after John the Baptist's arrest by Herod Antipas that Jesus began his own ministry. He started wandering the villages and towns of Galilee, preaching his message to the people. He also gathered around him a group of followers, his disciples. He recruited them from among the ordinary people of Galilee, fishermen, farmers, workers, even tax collectors. Some were also women. Jesus also performed a series of acts that form one of the most contentious aspects of his life, a set of miraculous deeds that are still hotly contested today. Were these miracles actual historical events, or just symbolic, figurative acts?
Any modern person in a scientific world is going to ask, are these miracles legit? Or are they rather really a case of early Christian myth-making, that early Christians admired and revered Jesus so much that eventually the stories about Jesus became magnified and he became this worker of great deeds? Well, your opinion on the question of whether miracles did happen or not is really a religious question. Either you believe that such things are possible, or you say, no, we know better, these aren't the kinds of things that happen, and you discredit them.
Dr. Greg Carey is an expert in the early followers of Jesus. He believes that Jesus' miracles have a sound basis in historical fact because he is convinced they were widely believed by the people at that time.
For the Bible, a miracle is something dramatically unusual that happens, so unusual and maybe beneficial or revelatory that people would interpret it as an act of the gods, some sort of divine intervention. The New Testament uses a couple of different words for miracle. It uses dunamis, which simply means a powerful deed, a mighty accomplishment of some sort, and semeia, which indicates a sign, something that reveals something about Jesus' nature. On the one hand, there's their benefit for people, especially the healing miracles, but even occasionally a nature miracle, such as turning water into wine. But the other dimension of the miracles is that they reveal something about Jesus.
On the 3rd day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples.
We are on a hill with the ruins of an ancient site. It's called by the Arabs Khirbet Gana. That's a very similar name to Cana. Cana from the New Testament, the place of the miracle of transferring the water to wine. And that's why it was identified by some scholars as the place of the miracle.
According to the Gospel account of this famous miracle, a large wedding party was suddenly disrupted by the wine running out, and Jesus was asked by his mother to intervene.
People gathered from the nearby villages. Nazareth is just 3 miles away, 4 miles away from here, as crow flies. And people gathered from villages. This is why you have to do it for a few days, because people are coming from far away. And what reflects from the story in the Bible is simple life. So suddenly, the wine is finished.
The key part of the story, occurred when Jesus told the servants to fill 6 stone jars with water and then to draw some out and take it to the master of the feast.
When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew.
The Gospel of John, though, concludes the story not just by saying, oh, everyone says, wow, this is an amazing miracle, but by saying this was the first of Jesus' signs, and that the Gospel of John is trying to say is that Jesus has the power to bring vitality and abundance, that living water will flow within them because of Jesus. That alludes to biblical prophecies that wine would flow down the hills of Israel like water. There's a suggestion that Jesus is the one who brings life. That's a part of this miracle.
At the site of Khirbet Kana, archaeologists have found a cave that they believe was used by early Christian pilgrims who wanted to reenact the famous miracle of turning water into wine and somehow share in its life-giving benefits.
This was probably, the beginning was a natural cave. But then when Christians identified this place, they took this cave and changed it, transferred it into a sacred place. What they did here is only some kind of a demonstration of the miracle itself, or to bring people in to see the exact place where the miracle really happened.
So they would have reenacted in some sort of ritual way the miracle, you think?
I assume so. This is a great example of what pilgrims are doing when they're coming to a holy site.
The miracle stories are an essential part of how the Gospels present Jesus and how early Christians understood Jesus. It's the case in the modern world that many people like to think of Jesus as a great moral teacher. But for the early Christians, it was just as important that Jesus could bring wholeness and wellness to people. The healings, for example, don't simply restore people to health, but they also restore people to their full place in society. They're no longer marginalized by their disability or by their uncleanness. The second reason these stories are essential, though, is that they're all revelatory. He's the bringer of life and the bringer of vitality. But the miracles often are interpreted in terms of stories from Israel's past, or interpreted in terms of the great deeds that God has performed with Israel.
This theme of abundance occurred throughout Jesus' miracles. The Gospels record 2 instances where he intervened to create miraculous catches of fish. The first occurred early in his ministry, when Jesus was calling his first disciples. He told some fishermen that if they went out into the deep water and cast their nets, they would land a huge catch of fish, so much so that it would fill their boats.
Now, the catch of fish is interesting because, of course, this is people's livelihood. It's a story that suggests not only that Peter and then James and John will be followers of Jesus, but also that their work will be effective and abundant in its success.
Greg Carey believes that because of a modern cynicism about miracles, many historians have downplayed their importance in Jesus' life story.
It used to be that scholars would rationalize the miracle stories of Jesus. For example, one scholar famously suggested that the story of Jesus walking on water involved an illusion, that Jesus was actually walking in a very shallow place, and the disciples just thought he was walking on water. And I think the reason that scholars interpreted miracles that way, of course being modern people, rationalistic, being of a scientific age, is that they tended to regard ancient people as superstitious or naive. But the reality is that ancient people were suspicious of miracle stories themselves, and they knew when something truly unusual was happening. So chances are that what we really have with the stories of Jesus is that in his own time and place, he did have a reputation as a miracle worker.
Miracles and miracle makers were a regular part of life for first-century Jews. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is full of miraculous deeds that people would have been very familiar with during Jesus' lifetime.
Every revolution in religion has to look like a natural continuity. That's the way to do it. So that's why it was very important to present Jesus as one of the prophets. And if you look at the stories of Moses, for instance, Moses crosses the Sea of Reeds. Of course, Jesus doesn't have to split the waters. He can walk upon the water. That's one example. You have also stories about, of course, bringing people back to life. Elijah does it, Elisha does it, so of course Jesus will do the same thing.
There are contemporary accounts from Jewish sources of rabbis who wandered the land performing miraculous deeds. One of the most famous was called Honi the Circle Drawer. His grave is still a shrine for Orthodox Jews today.
You know, in this area we never have enough rain. And a year after year you have a drought in this area. And Honi was the guy who could force God, to give us some rain. He drew a circle, stood within it, and told God that he would never leave this circle until God let some rain fall. And indeed, God listened to him. Because the relationship between Honi and God was like a relationship of a father, God the Father, and Honi the Son. In a way, quite similar to the relationship of Jesus and God.
Like Honi, some of Jesus' most famous miracles involved his power over nature, something that would have been very familiar to first-century Jews steeped in the traditions of the Old Testament.
And Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm.
This is interesting because Psalm 107 says that when the storms come up and they make people out on the sea afraid, God simply commands the waves to be peaceful and still, and they do. So when Jesus does this in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples say, "What sort of man is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." But readers of the Hebrew Bible know the answer. This is the man who's doing the things that only the God of Israel can do.
Jesus' reputation as a miracle maker clearly grows through the Gospels. More than 35 of his miracles are detailed, and they frequently drew huge crowds. But one of the most dramatic was performed to just 3 of his closest disciples when he was transfigured, revealed as the Son of God.
And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him.
Greg Carey believes that for first-century Jews, the Transfiguration would have had another symbolic significance in aligning Jesus with some of the most famous Old Testament prophets.
Moses, who represents the Torah, the law of Israel, and Elijah, one of the foremost of the prophets. Moses and Elijah have in common in the traditions of first-century Judaism that both of them escaped death, that both were taken up into heaven rather than died. So that in the Transfiguration of Jesus, you have a story that not only is dramatic, but beyond that, it connects Jesus with the traditions of Moses and Elijah. And it also, in some ways, foreshadows that this Jesus, though he will die, and he's just told his disciples that he would suffer death, that resurrection awaits. So we're here at the site that pilgrims come visit because of the Transfiguration of Jesus?
The Transfiguration is very important because, and here we enter the spiritual explanation. When Jesus was transfigured, he showed his divinity. His personal appearance was changed into a glorified form, and his clothing became dazzling white. And what does Transfiguration mean, 2010 years after the event? What is its meaning for us? St. Paul said, "Faith without works is dead." Jesus' transfiguration was first of all a vision before his death and resurrection in Jerusalem, but also a message for us to change your lives, transform yourselves, because faith without works is dead. Live with complete faith, but faith has to be accompanied with everyday good deeds.
For first-century Jews, Jesus' miracles were not only believable, They were a crucial part of being a successful rabbi and religious leader.
The way Jesus performs the miracles in the gospel stories is interpreted as a sign that he is God's agent. He speaks on his own initiative, and people respond and say, what sort of man is this who's able to make the sea calm? What the Gospels are trying to communicate is that Jesus acts on his own initiative, that he is the agent of God's coming reign. There's a story that Matthew and Luke share that John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus and say, "Are you the one who's to come, or should we be waiting for another?" And Jesus responds by telling them, well, the lame are walking, the blind are having their sight restored. That's the answer to the question, that in the coming of Jesus, the reign of God is breaking into the world, and it does so by bringing wholeness to people and communities.
According to these accounts, Jesus was also a teacher, a Jewish rabbi with a mission to reform the world in which he lived. Based in a small fishing village on the shores of Lake Galilee, he wandered the land preaching in synagogues, in village squares, wherever people met. And right from the very beginning of his adult life, he set forth a particular message, the true meaning of which has been debated ever since.
We understand Jesus as this meek, mild, wouldn't hurt or flee type guy. Rather than the very fiery revolutionary he was, we must ask ourselves, if he was such a nice guy, why would anyone bother to kill him? Why would anybody bother to follow him?
Aubrey Hendricks is an expert in the teachings of Jesus and is convinced that after Christianity was adopted by the Roman Empire in the 4th century under the Emperor Constantine, Jesus' revolutionary message was watered down to suit its new patron.
Jesus is understood through the prism of post-Constantinian Christianity. Remember, Constantine was the Roman emperor, and he declared himself the 13th apostle appointed by God, which meant that he could decide what was orthodoxy and what was not. And he understood Jesus' teaching from the perspective of those above. Jesus preached to the oppressed. With Constantine, the religion was turned on its head. It went from being the faith of the oppressed to the religion of the oppressor. And since that time, that's how Jesus' message has been understood and softened. The revolutionary nature of it has been softened.
To understand the true nature of Jesus' teachings, Aubrey Hendricks believes we must examine the original gospel accounts through the eyes of the first century audience for whom they were originally written.
I would characterize Jesus as fitting right into the mold of the classical biblical prophets who stood up and spoke truth to power, and whose main concern was for economic, political, and social justice for the little people. We see that throughout his ministry. We see that at the beginning of his ministry. He stands up and makes this very radical, revolutionary statement.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
And he posits right at that point that his main concern is for the poor, the little people. But more than that, good news to the poor implies that the structures that made people poor, kept them poor, were going to be resolved, going to be changed. And he talked about liberation of the oppressed. Now, this is a very radical manifesto. He's talking about economics. He's talking about political liberation.
During Jesus' lifetime, Israel was divided into several separate regions of the Roman Empire. Judea was under direct Roman occupation, and Galilee was ruled by a Roman client king. The people had few freedoms, and political and economic oppression were facts of life. Aubrey Hendricks believes Jesus' first sermon at Nazareth was a direct challenge to that status quo.
I mean, at first folks said, boy, we really like what he's saying here. This sounds great. But then they realized, well, wait a minute. This is really going to mess things up here for us. This is going to overturn the status quo. And we're told that they chased him to a place and wanted to kill him because they realized the radicality of what he was proposing. Maybe they were afraid that he was going to get the Romans angry. Maybe the elites were the ones in attendance at synagogue, and they realized, boy, this threatens our economic interests. But what that also tells us is that he was seen from the very beginning as this extremely radical, revolutionary figure that was going to bring more change if he was followed, more change in their lives and their society than they had seen since the time of the prophets.
One of the biggest challenges Jesus posed to first-century society was his attitude to women and how he made them a central part of his new movement. The Gospels tell us that one of his closest disciples was Mary Magdalene, and that she remained with him throughout his adult life, right up to his crucifixion. And in the Gospel of John, how she was even the first person to witness his resurrection.
In that setting, it was so patriarchal. Women were chattel, and women were seen as incomplete men. For Jesus to have a woman who seems to be part of that central group is a very radical reorientation. I mean, it's sort of a rereading of gender relations in that setting.
According to the Gospels, Mary Magdalene came from a city on the shores of Lake Galilee. 2 years ago, during construction work for a new hotel, archaeologists made an amazing discovery.
It was in August, and it's very hot, warm, and humid here. So we started to excavate. The earth is very strong and heavy and dry. We started to work there, and just underneath, 20 centimeter underneath the surface, we found this synagogue.
The Israeli archaeological team had discovered a synagogue from the time of Jesus. Its out-of-the-way location suggests it belonged to a marginalized community.
For us, it's very important because it's located at the edge of the city. It's not a very big one. As if I told you before that Magdala in this period was large city, okay, large
so there might have
village.
Been other larger ones?
Maybe there were more synagogues here, but in the city. But this one that we excavated is located at the edge, at the very edge, okay? And it's quite small. I think 100 or 150 people you can put together in this building. So
in a town of 40,000.
Yeah, in a town of 40,000 population. Okay, so what we think is this synagogue is concentrated for a special community, very special community, very special leader who built it.
It's possible, maybe even probable, that Jesus visited this synagogue. Being that it makes quite a bit of sense that he would have spent time in the largest city in this area, and actually got one of his disciples, Mary Magdalene, from this village. So he would have sat on one of these stones and participated in the worship. I'd call Jesus a revolutionary, absolutely, because he did what revolutionaries do. He challenged the structures of power. What he was talking about was a reorientation of social, political, and economic relationships. He talked about turning it upside down so that that everyone has enough to eat. Everyone has patrimony. No one is beaten down by classism and elitism and marginalized and looked down upon. No one's starving.
In order to spread his message among the peoples of Galilee and Judea, Aubrey Hendricks believes that Jesus adopted a deliberately political strategy to confront those in power, both the Roman overseers and the Jewish priestly authorities based at the temple in Jerusalem.
Can you imagine how empowering that was to the Galilean peasants who did not feel empowered, who felt like little people, and they saw one of them with his Galilean slurring of Aramaic and Hebrew, which, we'd call it sort of a country accent. He stands up to these erudite, sophisticated priests, and he tells them off, and then he indicts them just like the prophet that he was. You can't get much more revolutionary than that.
One of the key methods Jesus used to help explain his message was the parable, an ancient form of teaching very familiar to first-century Jews. A parable is a simple story that conveys a deeper message. They formed about a third of Jesus' recorded teachings and were full of images drawn from the rural Galilean world in which he lived.
He would tell a familiar story, take a familiar situation, whether it's about plants growing, harvesting, something that people were familiar with, laboring in the fields. In telling that story, he'd weave in a larger truth, or he'd tell it in a way that would bring to their consciousness some aspect of their experience that they hadn't really focused on. And so we're told in Matthew 20, the parable of the workers in the vineyard.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard.
Aubrey Hendricks reinterprets this parable as showing how some workers were exploited by an arrogant vineyard owner who dictated how much they should be paid. The story ends with Jesus suggesting that in the kingdom of heaven, this would change.
By the end of the parable, they've seen the injustice of the whole situation, the derisive, haughty attitudes of these upper-class elites, which again they probably just took for granted. And at the end, it ends up by saying, but the first will be the last, and the last will be the first. And we see this reversal motif framing the parable, which essentially is telling them, look, the kingdom of God is such as this. We change the way that we interact with each other. With what we accept, we change the configuration of power and authority and poverty and wealth, and it'll be such that this will not go on. This will change. It'll all be turned on its head.
And he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh.
Some of the most famous of Jesus' teachings are found in what is now called the Sermon on the Mount. They include the Beatitudes, a series of blessings that have always formed a central part of Christian teaching. Aubrey Hendricks believes the later church completely diluted and softened their original meaning.
The Beatitudes are usually understood as something nice for children to say in Sunday school, some user-friendly, personally pietistic sayings, group of sayings. And it's not often understood, though, how radical the setting of the Beatitudes and the meaning of the Beatitudes apparently were. Jesus begins by saying, blessed are you poor people. Not poor in spirit, as in Matthew, but in Luke, which we understand to be the earliest, most authentic form. Blessed are you poor. It continues his concern for the poor. But why would he have to tell them that they're blessed? Well, this gives us a sense of how beaten down the people were and how and what important part of his consciousness-raising campaign it was to empower people. And then he goes on to say, blessed are you that hunger now. He's talking about poverty and hunger. It is an implicit indictment of what's going on at the time, but by telling the people that they're blessed and beginning by talking about the kingdom of God, he's saying that, but under my teachings, this would change.
But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep.
In my imagination, I'd love to see Jesus come back long enough to restate these things in his own voice. So people could see, well, whoa, wait a minute, I really have this thing wrong. So they could see his righteous indignation. So they could see his outrage at the poverty of the people, his outrage at the haughty riches of folk walking around not concerned about those who have too little. That's, if we could just get a glimpse of that Jesus for one day, just come back, Jesus, and tell us what you really were teaching. This would be could be a very, very different world. I'm not sure, though, that those who are in power wouldn't crucify him all over again if he came preaching the same way.
The Gospels tell us that Jesus continued to preach his revolutionary message all over Galilee, and that his movement grew as he traveled from village to village and town to town. Historians disagree as to how long his ministry lasted. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke suggest a period of up to 1 year, but the Gospel of John implies it lasted 3 years or more. All of them agree that its climax was reached when Jesus decided to go to the Jewish capital, Jerusalem.
If we ask the question why Jerusalem is so important to Jesus, there are a host of reasons we could give. It's the place of festival that Jewish people from all over the world would come to in order to celebrate Passover, Sukkot, Hanukkah, Yom Kippur, the major Jewish festivals. But why at the climax of his ministry would he take his disciples deliberately up to Jerusalem? Well, he's told them before, the Son of Man must suffer many things, and he warns them in advance that he, the Son of Man, is destined for a sudden, drastic end. He is what Dorothy Sayers calls the man born to die.
Right at the heart of Jerusalem was the Jewish temple, the holiest site for Jews. Although almost all of it was later destroyed by the Romans, its remains are still sacred for Jews today. Dr. Ben Witherington is an expert in the life of Jesus. He believes that because Jerusalem was regarded as the center of the world by first-century Jews, it is key to understanding the meaning of Jesus' life story.
One of the things that seems clear is that Jesus is not doing, there's nothing that's happening by accident. He does seem to have a plan. There's an intentionality to what he's doing. And one of the things that's very clear about this is that there's a series of prophetic sign acts.
According to the Gospels, Jesus performed a series of deliberate and provocative acts in Jerusalem that would help his followers understand who he believed he was. The first occurred as he approached the city with his disciples.
Go into the village in front of you, where on entering you will find a colt tied, on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here.
This is the only place in the Gospels where he elevates himself above the crowd. He sits on a donkey, he rides into town, in the middle of them already singing the hallelujahs and hosannas. And right at the beginning again, that they see this as a royal gesture about the King of Peace coming into his city to bring peace to the city of Jerusalem, to return the land to its original owners, because Judea is an occupied province. It's run by Rome directly.
First-century Jews would have known that this act of entering Jerusalem on a donkey referred to an Old Testament prophecy about a Jewish Messiah coming to free Israel from its current misery, a concept that was central to Jewish thinking at the time.
At that time, you had a lot of groups who weren't quite satisfied with what was going on at the temple. A lot of groups who weren't happy with the Roman rule. And those people were looking forward to the Anointed One and started talking about the Anointed One. This is the one that we really believe will come and do the job right. And so it was one of the hot potatoes that was being passed around, defining exactly who this Messiah should be and who he will be.
Jesus next entered the holiest place for Jews, the temple. Ben Witherington believes the gospel writers saw what Jesus did there as prophesying God's coming judgment on the corrupt temple leadership.
And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers.
Jesus sees this as a violation of the presence of God in the midst of God's people. So this is a warning, if you will, that the temple of Herod is the temple of doom and it's going down for the count. What we really have here is a foreshadowing of judgment that's going to fall on the whole temple mechanism altogether.
At the very time the first Gospels were being written, just 40 years after Jesus' death, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, this prophecy appeared to be fulfilled. The Gospels tell us, over the next few days, Jesus continued to visit the temple, teaching and debating in the courtyards in full view of the temple authorities who were becoming increasingly anxious about his presence.
For them to picture this Jesus coming across and ideas that he was going to take this temple down to its foundations and that after 3 days raise it up was a big threat to them, because this is the place where God dwells. For him to go inside and to upset the carts and to create the big scene that he did there was something that would be tantamount to treason and perhaps to some would be the prelude to his death.
From the perspective of the disciples, obviously the tension is ratcheting up. They're thinking, we are heading for a dramatic climax. Here we go. And any of them who had tendencies to think in sort of zealot-like directions were expecting, let's get ready to rumble.
In the Gospel accounts, the temple authorities then send a spy to try and trick Jesus into publicly denying the Roman Emperor Caesar's right to tax them, a crime punishable by death. But Jesus demands a Roman coin with Caesar's face on it and utters one of his most famous sayings.
Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him.
Now this is a tremendously ironic saying, because of course, from the biblical point of view, everything is God's. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So thinking that God has a sphere and Caesar has a sphere and they're sort of neatly divided or separatable is laughable. And anybody who heard this saying would know that this is a riddle, a deliberate riddle. And it stumps the inquisitors. Instead of Jesus being stumped, it stumps them.
To fully understand what Jesus was doing in Jerusalem, Ben Witherington believes that we need to examine an event earlier in his life, before he came to the city, when he revealed who he was to his disciples in secret. According to the Gospels, while he was still in Galilee, Jesus took his disciples north to a pagan city called Caesarea Philippi, a place full of ancient temples where sacrifices would have been made to pagan gods. It was also a center for the newly created emperor cult, in which the Roman Emperor Augustus was worshipped as a son of the gods.
And then Jesus looks directly at the disciples and says, but who do you say that I am? Simon raises his hand and says, I know. You're the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, the Son of the living God. And what Jesus is saying is that if you identify me in that way, but recognize the larger cosmopolitan context, I'm not just the Jewish Messiah, I am the Son of God, not a son of the gods like Augustus, the Son of God, and my community will be built on confessions like you have just made, and the gates of death, of Hades, will not prevail against it. It's a fantastic location to help them reorient their thinking, understanding that it's too little to say he's the Jewish Messiah. No, he is the reality of which Caesar and these other gods are only a parody. And he chose precisely this spot outside of the Holy Land to reveal to them and to answer for them the who question.
But Jesus then ends the story with a mysterious plea for his disciples not to tell anyone.
Jesus wants to reveal himself on his own terms. And there were lots of pre-existing expectations about what a son of David or a messianic figure would look like. He wants to fill that category with his own content, on his own terms. He doesn't want his story resolved prematurely before he's able to conclude it in the way he thinks God wants it concluded. But more importantly, what we've got here that sets up that last week is Jesus not only answers the who question for the disciples, he forewarns them that as Son of Man, he must face execution at the hands of those who ought to most appreciate him, the Jewish authorities.
One other time, before his trial and death, when Jesus' messianic identity was revealed publicly, was in Jerusalem when he cured a blind man.
As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?"
The healing took place near Siloam, a ritual pool just outside the city's southern gate. Historians had argued for centuries over its exact location until 5 years ago, when some routine work on a sewer pipe revealed the ancient pool. Israeli archaeologist Professor Ronnie Reich has been excavating it ever since.
So we're coming down into the edge of the pool here.
Yeah.
And what have we got here?
We are exactly at the southern edge of the city of David, which is part of Jerusalem, outside that hill, in the Theological Valley, which is in fact also the lowest place in Jerusalem.
Having said these things, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam."
So let's ask the biblical question. Why did Jesus send this man to the pool of Siloam?
And I asked myself, did he just say, "Go take the dirt off your face and see," or complete the entire process, which included in those days also a process of purification. A pure state could be obtained in a mikveh, in a ritual bath, especially from severe inflictions which were cured, like blindness, like leprosy.
In the story, the blind man then ritually purified himself by bathing in the pool. And according to Jewish custom, to complete the purification process, he would then almost certainly have headed to the temple.
So where are we at this point?
And we are now standing right under the street, and from here we actually have a free way to the Temple Mount.
So the part of the story we don't really see is the blind man fulfilling the rest of the process, and he's going to head up this way to the Temple Mount. In early Judaism, there was a saying that when you find someone who can give sight to the blind, you will know for sure Messiah has come. Well, that's what this story is about, and it's masterfully told. It's the longest continuous narrative in the Gospel of John, and it's really a story of ships passing in the night. For the blind man gains sight and more insight as the story goes further and further, until finally he's going to kneel and confess Jesus to be the Son of Man, which is what Jesus asks of the man.
"Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you."
It's the only place in the Gospels Jesus is confessed to be the Son of Man. By contrast, you have the Pharisees and the Jewish authorities who claim to see, to understand, to know all about what Messiah must be like, and they become more hard-hearted and blinder. So the story climaxes with them saying, "Surely you're not saying we too are blind." It's a masterful story of ships passing in the night, one into the light, the other into darkness.
But this action of giving sight is many times used as a metaphor. Spiritual blindness, or I mean, people don't see what is just with open eyes, with seeing eyes, what is happening just in front of them, right? And an explanation opens their eyes, not a medical healing.
This story then is not just an ordinary miracle, yet another of one of the many healings of the great physician Jesus. Now, this is a story that presages the end of the story. It's a story that reveals the messianic character of Jesus. For who can give sight to the blind but God Himself?
Jesus was now established as a rabbi who could perform miracles and exorcisms. After John the Baptist's arrest, he had formed his own small movement and been revealed to his closest disciples as the Son of God. He had begun spreading his revolutionary message throughout Galilee, and when he brought it to Jerusalem, he came into conflict with the ruling powers in the temple. In the next part, we will see how the gospel story of Jesus reached its culmination in the founding events of Christianity: his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection.
The Roman soldiers were professional killers, and especially they were good at killing people who were rebel leaders, which is how they saw Jesus.
It's almost a kangaroo court in which all the normal laws of legal proceedings are completely thrown out of the window.
This required a lot of explanation. Crucified Messiah would have been seen as a contradiction in terms.
This was torture, and we refused to take it seriously.